Thanks, Janelle. Now we'll have Tim Sainburg, Marvin Thielk, and Timothy Gentner present Learn Context-Dependent Categorical Perception in a Songbird.
Okay, so I'm going to be talking about how perceptual spaces are learned and modulated in a model songbird, the European starling. There we go. So perception is the interpretation of some sensory signal into an experience. So for example, we might hear some sound, our brains will process that information, and we'll recognize it as, say, a bell ringing. We might expect our perceptions to have one-to-one correspondences with signals that exist in the real world. For example, if we take this grid of signals, so if you imagine each one of these black dots as being a signal, we might expect kind of a one-to-one correspondence with our perceptual space. But in reality, our perceptions are these very warped versions of signals that exist in the real world. So for example, in this study by Iverson and Kuhl, a grid of smoothly varying phonemes are taken from formant space. So here the x and y axes are just formant frequencies, which are features of speech, and each one of these black dots is a formant. The left half correspond to phonemes. The left half correspond to R phonemes, and the right half correspond to L phonemes, as in rake and lake. And when they play these back to English speakers and Japanese speakers, what they find is that the perceptual similarity between these different phonemes is greater within category, and these perceptual differences are exaggerated between categories, between these categorical boundaries. Whereas in Japanese speakers who don't differentiate between that R and L phoneme, you don't see those same sort of perceptual warping. So basically, you see this stretching around perceptual categories and this shrinking within them. But perceptual boundaries are not always frozen. So for example, contextual information can bias these perceptual boundaries. So if you imagine this continuum from duh to tuh and another feature of speech, voice onset time, and you embed this continuum within, say, a word or a non-word, so for example, dark to tark, you'll get some perceptual boundary between when you stop perceiving dark and start perceiving tark. So from that word to non-word continuum, versus when you would transfer from non-word to word, your perceptual boundary would be shifted. So for example, from dask to task. So as a result of that contextual information, because you expect to hear the word dark or the word task and not those non-words, your perceptual categories boundaries will shift. So the central question of this presentation is, what are the cognitive and neural mechanisms for pushing around those categorical boundaries? So we're going to study this phenomena in songbirds, and the reason we're using songbirds is because wild songbirds exhibit many of these different features of speech perception that I just described, like categorical perception. Different communities of songbirds in different regions will have categorical perception shifted in different ways, much the same as the Japanese American English speaker example. And within a song, these syllables will be contextually, the perception of these syllables will be contextually dependent upon, for example, position within a song. So this study can be broken up into 3 parts. Part 1 is about learning a reduced dimensional space that will allow us to smoothly vary features of songbird vocalizations. So you can think about this as just a way for creating these kind of smoothly varying grids of features of birdsong. Part 2 is about developing a task in which we can contextually modulate categorical perception. And then part 3 is just searching for a cognitive and neural correlates for this phenomena. So this is an example of a single European starling song. They're about a minute long. You just saw a bunch of spectrograms, so I'm not going to go into detail. But you'll see that there are these kind of syllables that exist. The resolution here is not too great, so it's kind of hard to see, but they're surrounded by periods of silence. So each one of these, this is kind of a very easily distinguishable syllable. And what I want to be able to do is I want to be able to translate that song into a distribution in sort of a lower dimensional space. And then I want to be able to sample from that distribution and translate it back into, say, a grid or a continuously sampleable, smoothly varying grid of syllables in birdsong. And then I can use those syllables to play them back in our operant conditioning apparatuses and see if I can push around that categorical perception or that warp their perceptual spaces. So to do this, first we take our vocalizations, our waveforms of our vocalizations. We convert them into spectrograms and segment them based upon silences in that audio envelope. Then we just resize and pad everything to be the same size. And then throw these into a form of neural network called a variational autoencoder, where basically we have our inputs as syllables, and we talked about these variational autoencoders yesterday. We have these inputs as syllables. We try to compress them into a lower dimensional representation and recover those original syllables. So this is what an autoencoder looks like. You have your syllable as input. You have your encoder network, which encodes them into a latent representation, lower dimensional representation. And then you decode from that lower dimensional representation back into a syllable's output. So basically, you're trying to squeeze your syllable input through a lower dimensional representation while still being able to recover your output, so dimensionality reduction. So this is the actual architecture we have, or something similar to the actual architecture. We use just a convolutional autoencoder where the latent space is a fairly small number of neurons. So here I'm just visualizing this as 2. And then what we can do is we can take each one of our syllables, pass it through the encoder, and project it into latent space. So the activation of each one of these 2 neurons here is plotted as the x and y axes, and each one of these black dots represents a syllable. So this is about 30,000 syllables of a single male European starling song. And then we can continuously sample from this space. So we just sample these red dots, pass them through the decoder of the network, and produce these kind of smoothly varying syllables, which we can then translate back into audio waveforms and play back to the birds in our operant conditioning apparatuses. So I should mention here that the actual neural network that we're using is a variational autoencoder with 64 latent dimensions. This is from a different project, just to kind of help you visualize this. So now we can produce these smoothly varying syllables of birdsong. So here's just an interpolation in latent space between 2 syllables. And we can play them back to the songbirds in this operant conditioning apparatus. So I'll call the left half of these syllables reinforce left, and the right half reinforce right. And the bird has to peck left if it hears one of these, and it has to peck right if it hears one of these. And if it does, it gets some free food. So from there, I can get a psychometric function of the bird's behavior. So it's going to be pretty good at reinforce left all the way to one anchor, and pretty good all the way to the other anchor. It's going to have some trouble around the middle. And what I'm interested in is whether I can shift that categorical boundary, as a function of contextual information. And so the way that I'm doing this is I'm playing a Q syllable that precedes the reinforced syllable. So I just have a Q syllable here, a context syllable that has some predictive information over this reinforced syllable. So a context left syllable predicts that a reinforced left syllable, something on this half of the interpolation, will occur, and the reinforced right opposite, or the context right opposite. So this is just another visualization of this. If I play the context left syllable, the bird should expect that a reinforced left syllable is going to occur with a higher probability than the reinforced right. We can modulate this, and the context right does the exact opposite thing. So to sum up the task, there are 9 interpolations. So I just showed one before, but we have 9 different interpolations. We train the birds to classify reinforced left and reinforced right just by pecking these peckboards. And then we throw these Q syllables in beforehand, or these contextual syllables in beforehand, which hold some predictive information over what the reinforced syllable is going to be, or what the categorical syllable is going to be. And our hypothesis is that we're going to be able to shift that categorical boundary as a function of that predictive information, or as a function of that context. So here's an example of what that sounds like. So you'll hear the Q, or the context, and then the reinforced syllable. So that's just the Q left and the Q right, and then 2 reinforced syllables. So we can model this hypothesis as just simple Bayesian integration. We can treat our prior probability as that Q probability that I just described. So you're more likely to hear reinforced left syllable if you hear Q left, and conversely for the Q right. And again, we modulate these probabilities. And the likelihood is just a Gaussian centered around the true syllable that's heard. So say you hear syllable 30, you're most likely going to sense that as syllable 30. There's a decent chance that it'll be recognized as syllable 20, and it's very unlikely that it'll be recognized as syllable 100. And then we can get the posterior just by taking the 2 together. So say you hear syllable 15, regardless of that Q probability, you're pretty definite that this is syllable 15, but around those categorical boundaries, given the fact that you had this cue that this is probably going to be a right stimulus, you're going to shift, you're going to modulate your expectations. So you might perceive this as being a reinforced right stimuli, so around that categorical boundary. And so what that ends up doing is that it ends up shifting in this model the perceptual boundaries between these two syllables. So you're going to modulate this psychometric function either to the left or the right based upon that information. So there's basically two kinds of hypotheses that we could have. The first is the Bayesian integration, which I just described, in which we have this shifting of boundary that would be dependent upon the predictive probability of that cue stimulus or that categorical, the contextual stimulus. So there would be a relationship between these two things. And then we could just imagine that there would be some sort of, as an alternative, just an additive bias. So you wouldn't see a shift in that categorical boundary, but you might see an overall shift in, I heard a cue left stimulus, therefore this is more likely to be a left stimuli regardless of where we are on the interpolation. And in that case, there wouldn't be any sort of relationship. So we did this study with 7 different songbirds. So we have 7 European starlings. We fit psychometric functions, each one of their behaviors. And if we subtract out those kind of additive biases, what we see is that there is this consistent shift in this psychometric function for each one of the birds. And actually, if we look across each one of the conditions, so we have these 9 different interpolations, we have these multiple different cueing probabilities, and we have these 7 different birds. So that's just all of these together. We consistently see a delta in that categorical boundary in the direction that we would expect, so in the direction of that cue probability. And we also see this fairly strong relationship between the perceived categorical boundary, so that shifted categorical boundary, and that cue probability of the contextual stimulus. Okay, so now this is kind of current things that I'm working on, but in ongoing physiological investigations, I'm recording from secondary auditory regions in the songbird brain. So basically I'm recording from these regions CMM and NCM, which are just 2 secondary auditory regions in songbird brain. And I'm playing back these stimuli while the birds are anesthetized, recording from 32-channel extracellular electrodes, getting some populations of single neurons that I can perform analyses on. So basically there's 2 things that I'm looking for. One is contextual dependency in these neuronal responses, and the second is categorical selectivity in general. So I'm not going to talk about this in depth because this is kind of ongoing work, and I just have a few examples for now. But briefly, I'm computing single neuron responses, so we'll play back these stimuli. We'll play them back several times, so each of these is a trial. And each one of these ticks represents a single spike from that neuron. And then we can get just kind of peristimulus time histogram style plots of the spiking response to that single stimuli. And then we can compare them across the interpolation. So on this axis is interpolation, and what we see is this neural response. So this is just a visualization of this. This isn't the best example neuron, but we can then look across populations. So here we would just take this vector for each one of the neurons in, say, a single site, a single population, and look at the correlation between that neural response and, say, a neural response to a different stimuli, so say stimuli 3 versus stimuli 100, and they'd be lower in correlation than say stimuli 3 and stimuli 4, where you would expect to see a higher correlation. And you can also look at the within category versus between category responses. So this is just kind of a very kind of first pass analysis, but what you're seeing is that within category there are these kind of higher correlations than between category, and obviously in this plot I'm not controlling for anything like spectral similarity or acoustic similarity, but these are the kind of analyses that I'm working on right now as I collect this data. So in summary, we have these generative models for learning a quantitative representational space of birdsong that I think can be applied to a lot of different other sorts of perceptual tasks. We have this context-dependent categorical perception task that we can, to some extent, explain with this Bayesian integration model. And we're kind of undergoing these physiological investigations with these secondary auditory neural regions or nuclei in songbird brain. So I'd like to thank you guys for listening. Thanks CCN, and thank my advisor, Tim Gentner, and Marvin Thielk, who worked with me on this project. Marvin's presenting kind of a similar project about perceptual spaces in songbird auditory perception called Combining Biological and Artificial Approaches to Understanding Perceptual Spaces for Categorizing Natural Acoustic Signals later today. So thanks.
Hi, that was very interesting. I was wondering if you think of those asymptotic errors on the psychometric function as just guesses that the animals make.
Yeah.
On
I went
the
to
basis of
poster
their prior.
yesterday, and I was really interested by the
Yes,
the,
you would
the
actually
interpretation
expect
you
both
had.
of those.
Yeah, so in the Bayesian models, I do kind of just assume that those are guesses, but I definitely
Right.
would have interest in kind of looking at the other reasons that those might happen.
Awesome. We should
Yeah.
talk more. Thanks.
Great talk.
Thanks.
Simple question. Did the animals that went to the Q learning were first trained on the categories?
Sorry, what?
In the experiment, when you trained them with priming them with the Q, did you first train them separately on the categories?
Yeah, so I first train them. I actually include the Q throughout the training, but I make the predictive probability nothing, so it's just 50-50 initially. And then once they've kind of learned the task, the categorical task, then I shift them over to giving the Q probability some value. So say for a month they're trained on nothing, and then for a month they're trained on that 75% predictive probability, and then maybe for a month I'll shift them over to an 87.5% predictive probability. So that's why you saw that 5 different values. Yeah.
Thanks.